Hello and welcome to Sleepy Story. Tonight we open a candlelit door into one of the most unsettling and least spoken rituals of the medieval world, the wedding night. Before we begin, let me pause to thank you. It means so much that you are here. Whether you are listening from your room in the quiet hours, resting with your headphones, or letting this story keep you company as you drift towards sleep. Thank you for being part of this little circle of calm curiosity. If you enjoy these journeys into history, your support, subscribing, liking, or simply sharing this space gives me the strength to keep creating. It may sound small, but it truly matters. Now, I should offer a gentle warning. Tonight's story may be soothing in tone, but the customs and fears of the past are sometimes darker than the candlelight that surrounds them. If you find yourself wide awake with curiosity instead of sleep, don't worry. You'll carry a story into your dreams, and that is its own kind of rest. So, let us begin. Imagine a medieval castle. Outside, the torches burn along stone walls, slick with damp night air. Inside, corridors echo with the shuffle of guests leaving the feast. The wedding has been celebrated with music, prayers, and solemn vows. The bride, often scarcely more than a teenager, is led toward the bedchamber. She is dressed in layers of cloth, heavy with embroidery, her head crowned with flowers now wilting from the heat of the hall. She knows what waits. Or perhaps she does not know fully, which is worse. The medieval wedding night was not a private matter of tenderness. It was a public stage, shaped by law, by church, and by custom. For a marriage to be recognized, it needed not only vows at the altar, but consummation in the bed. And so, what should have been an intimate act between two people was often transformed into ritualized proof. Witnesses might accompany the couple to the chamber. In some places, the bedding ceremony required attendants to escort the bride and groom, to undress them, to bless the bed, sometimes even to remain until the curtains were drawn. Imagine the pressure, the fear, the weight of eyes. For many medieval women, the wedding night was not a moment of joy, but a passage through dread. Dread of pain, of shame, of uncertainty. Dread of becoming property under law. Dread of pregnancy, which was both expectation and risk. Stories from the time do not often record the bride's voice, but in the silences between lines, in the brief mentions of trembling, we hear her. Tonight, we're going to walk slowly through that silence. We will explore why these nights carried such heavy fear. We'll see the rituals, the church's role, the strange mixture of festivity and control. We'll listen to the echoes of women's lives left in diaries, in sermons, in whispered folk tales. And we will ask what it meant to live in a world where the first night of marriage was less about love and more about proof, property, and power. So settle back. The feast has ended. The torches burn low. The bride stands at the threshold of a chamber, not of her choosing. What happens when the door closes behind her will shape not only her life, but our understanding of an age where love was bound to law and fear was dressed as ritual. The music had faded, the feast was over, and the castle corridors grew quiet. But for the bride, her journey into the bedchamber had only just begun. In the medieval world, the wedding night was not merely the private beginning of a new life together. It was a ceremony in itself, one that demanded witnesses, blessings, and proof. This was the bedding ceremony, a ritual that revealed just how little control a woman had over her most intimate moments. To understand the fear, we must first imagine the ritual. After the wedding vows were spoken, the guests did not simply disperse into the night. Instead, they gathered once more to escort the couple to the marriage bed. In noble families, this procession could include dozens of people: priests, parents, attendants, friends, and even curious onlookers. The atmosphere was a strange mixture of celebration and solemnity, heavy with wine and laughter, but also with judgment. The bedding ceremony was both symbolic and practical. Symbolic, because the act of undressing the bride was framed as the shedding of her maidenhood, a passage from girl to woman. Practical, because the consummation of marriage was required for the union to be recognized as valid. Without it, the vows at the altar could be contested. Property, inheritance, alliances, all depended on proof that the marriage had been completed. And so, what should have been the tender privacy of two souls became a matter of public concern. In some regions, the ritual was performed with song and merriment. Guests would joke, drink, and tease the couple as they were led to the chamber. In other places, the ritual turned darker, more humiliating. The bride might be stripped of her clothing piece by attendants, her body prayed over, her bed sprinkled with holy water. Sometimes a priest would recite blessings to ward off demons, as if the union of flesh required divine supervision. Imagine the weight of such a moment, the body not a sanctuary, but a spectacle. For many brides, fear must have risen long before the door was closed. Fear of exposure, fear of ridicule, fear of pain. The language of the time rarely recorded these emotions directly. Women's voices were often silenced in chronicles written by men. But traces remain. A few letters, a few lines in diaries reveal trembling hands, tears quickly wiped away. A dread that the wedding night was less about joining with a partner and more about surrendering to a ritualized loss of self. The church played a central role. It taught that marriage was holy, but it also declared that the marital act was both duty and proof. In sermons, priests reminded women that their bodies now belonged to their husbands, that refusal was sin. The bedding ceremony, sanctified with blessings, carried this message into every chamber. This was not a choice, but an obligation. To resist was to risk scandal, annulment, or worse, accusations of witchcraft or possession. For the bride, the fear was not only physical, it was spiritual, social, and eternal. And yet, beneath the solemnity, there was also a current of crude festivity. Some guests treated the moment like entertainment. Songs were sung, riddles shouted, bawdy jokes exchanged. What was terrifying for the bride was, for others, a chance to laugh at the boundary between sacred and profane. In some accounts, the couple were left only after being tucked into bed by the attendants, the curtains drawn, the candles extinguished, the room still filled with the murmur of voices outside the door. Imagine standing in that chamber, the laughter fading, the silence growing heavy. The bed is no longer just a bed. It is a stage upon which power, law, and expectation converge. For the woman, it is the threshold between one life and another, a crossing made under the watchful eyes of family, church, and society. And though history records the ritual in terms of custom and law, the memory of it, etched in silence, in unspoken fear, reminds us of the human cost hidden beneath tradition. Tonight, as you let your thoughts drift into the quiet of the past, consider this: how much of the bedding ceremony was truly about union, and how much was about control? The church's shadow stretched across every marriage in medieval Europe. To speak vows in front of a priest was not enough. To stand before God was not enough. What mattered most, what bound the union into permanence, was the moment when words became flesh. And in that shadowed chamber, the church did not simply watch from afar. It declared itself present in law, in ritual, and in the whispered fears that traveled from pulpit to bed. For a medieval bride, the knowledge of this presence was inescapable. Long before her wedding night, she would have heard sermons warning that her body was no longer her own. Priests repeated endlessly that the wife's role was one of obedience, that she was to submit as the church submitted to Christ. These lessons were not given in gentle tones. They thundered from pulpits, carried through confessionals, and were reinforced in every catechism. Imagine hearing such words from childhood onward, until obedience no longer seemed like a choice but like the air itself, heavy, constant, unavoidable. And then came the bedding ceremony, that half-sacred, half-profane ritual where the church's hand rested heavily upon the sheets. Before the guests left, before the chamber grew quiet, blessings were spoken. Holy water might be flicked onto the bed, as though it were an altar. Crosses were traced over the couple as though their union were a kind of sacrament. Relics, bits of bone or cloth tied to saints, could be placed at the bedposts, guardians against demonic forces thought to lurk in the night. In the minds of the clergy, sex was dangerous. It invited sin, temptation, even spiritual corruption. It had to be wrapped in prayers, sealed with blessings, fenced with ritual. To the bride, however, this was not reassurance. It was pressure. If even holy water was needed to protect the marriage bed, then what was about to happen must be terrifying indeed. If priests spoke so often of sin, then what if she failed? What if she resisted? What if her fear itself became a mark of disobedience in God's eyes? The weight of theology pressed into the very fabric of marriage law. The church declared that consummation was what made marriage indissoluble. Without it, the vows could be undone, annulled as though they had never been spoken. And annulments were not theoretical. They were real, devastating tools. A bride who failed to consummate could be cast back to her family in disgrace. Her dowry might be lost. Her reputation would be scarred beyond repair. Imagine lying awake on that first night, knowing that failure did not mean only personal humiliation. It could unravel alliances, property, and peace between families. Court records tell us how public these matters became. In one case, a young woman's entire future was debated before bishops because her husband claimed she would not yield on the wedding night. Witnesses were called to testify about what they heard outside the chamber door. Sheets were inspected for proof of blood. Physicians were asked to examine the bride's body to confirm her virginity. Each step turned private intimacy into public theatre, with her dignity the cost of admission. The silence of her voice in the record is deafening. All we hear is judgment, never confession of her feelings, never her defense. The sermons reinforce this imbalance. Priests did not tell husbands to fear, only wives to obey. They spoke of the husband's right as if it were heaven's law. For the bride, it was a reminder that her fear was irrelevant. She was bound by divine command to submit, and if she trembled under God's gaze as well as man's. Picture her there, sitting at the edge of the bed after the procession has left. The heavy gown lies in a pile on the floor. The air smells faintly of wax and incense from the blessing just given. Her hands twist in her lap, pale fingers knotted together. The Latin prayers still echo in her mind, words she cannot fully understand but knows well enough to fear. She glances at the crucifix hanging above the bed, placed there by a priest, and wonders, does God watch her now? Will heaven judge her if she weeps, if she hesitates, if she prays not for union, but for escape? The dread was not only of physical pain, it was the dread of spiritual failure, of being marked as disobedient, of losing everything she had been told was sacred. And this dread was magnified by the stories whispered by older women. Warnings about blood, about injury, about death in childbirth waiting down the road. The church, instead of comforting, often made these fears sharper. To suffer was holy, they said. To submit was righteous. Even agony could be sanctified if endured in silence. One cannot help but wonder how many brides lay awake long after the candles were extinguished, listening to the murmur of voices outside the door, trying not to cry too loudly for fear that their tears would be heard. How many prayed with all their hearts not for blessing, but for the strength to endure what had already been commanded? How many asked themselves in the dark, if this is holy, why does it feel like fear? And so the church's role was double-edged. It declared marriage sacred, but in doing so it sanctified fear. It blessed obedience, but in doing so it made resistance sinful. It offered holy water, relics, and prayers. But beneath them all lay the unspoken truth. The bride's dread was not a failing of her courage, but the very outcome the system produced. The church's shadow stretched across every marriage in medieval Europe. To speak vows in front of a priest was not enough. To stand before God was not enough. What mattered most, what bound the union into permanence, was the moment when words became flesh. And in that shadowed chamber, the church did not simply watch from afar. It declared itself present in law, in ritual, and in the whispered fears that travelled from pulpit to bed. For a medieval bride, the knowledge of this presence was inescapable. Long before her wedding night, she would have heard sermons warning that her body was no longer her own. Priests repeated endlessly that the wife's role was one of obedience, that she was to submit as the church submitted to Christ. These lessons were not given in gentle tones. They thundered from pulpits, carried through confessionals, and were reinforced in every catechism. Imagine hearing such words from childhood onward, until obedience no longer seemed like a choice but like the air itself, heavy, constant, unavoidable. And then came the bedding ceremony, that half-sacred, half-profane ritual where the church's hand rested heavily upon the sheets. Before the guests left, before the chamber grew quiet, blessings were spoken. Holy water might be flicked onto the bed, as though it were an altar. Crosses were traced over the couple as though their union were a kind of sacrament. Relics, bits of bone or cloth tied to saints, could be placed at the bedposts, guardians against demonic forces thought to lurk in the night. In the minds of the clergy, sex was dangerous. It invited sin, temptation, even spiritual corruption. It had to be wrapped in prayers, sealed with blessings, fenced with ritual. To the bride, however, this was not reassurance. It was pressure. If even holy water was needed to protect the marriage bed, then what was about to happen must be terrifying indeed. If priests spoke so often of sin, then what if she failed? What if she resisted? What if her fear itself became a mark of disobedience in God's eyes? The weight of theology pressed into the very fabric of marriage law. The church declared that consummation was what made marriage indissoluble. Without it, the vows could be undone, annulled as though they had never been spoken. And annulments were not theoretical. They were real, devastating tools. A bride who failed to consummate could be cast back to her family in disgrace. Her dowry might be lost. Her reputation would be scarred beyond repair. Imagine lying awake on that first night, knowing that failure did not mean only personal humiliation. It could unravel alliances, property, and peace between families. Court records tell us how public these matters became. In one case, a young woman's entire future was debated before bishops because her husband claimed she would not yield on the wedding night. Witnesses were called to testify about what they heard outside the chamber door. Sheets were inspected for proof of blood. Physicians were asked to examine the bride's body to confirm her virginity. Each step turned private intimacy into public theatre, with her dignity the cost of admission. The silence of her voice in the record is deafening. All we hear is judgment, never confession of her feelings, never her defense. The sermons reinforced this imbalance. Priests did not tell husbands to fear, only wives to obey. They spoke of the husband's right as if it were heaven's law. For the bride, it was a reminder that her fear was irrelevant. She was bound by divine command to submit, and if she trembled under God's gaze as well as man's. Picture her there, sitting at the edge of the bed after the procession has left. The heavy gown lies in a pile on the floor. The air smells faintly of wax and incense from the blessing just given. Her hands twist in her lap, pale fingers knotted together. The Latin prayers still echo in her mind, words she cannot fully understand but knows well enough to fear. She glances at the crucifix hanging above the bed, placed there by a priest, and wonders, does God watch her now? Will heaven judge her if she weeps, if she hesitates, if she prays not for union, but for escape? The dread was not only of physical pain, it was the dread of spiritual failure, of being marked as disobedient, of losing everything she had been told was sacred. And this dread was magnified by the stories whispered by older women. Warnings about blood, about injury, about death in childbirth waiting down the road. The church, instead of comforting, often made these fears sharper. To suffer was holy, they said. To submit was righteous. Even agony could be sanctified if endured in silence. One cannot help but wonder how many brides lay awake long after the candles were extinguished, listening to the murmur of voices outside the door, trying not to cry too loudly for fear that their tears would be heard. How many prayed with all their hearts not for blessing, but for the strength to endure what had already been commanded? How many asked themselves in the dark, if this is holy, Why does it feel like fear? And so the church's role was double-edged. It declared marriage sacred, but in doing so it sanctified fear. It blessed obedience, but in doing so it made resistance sinful. It offered holy water, relics, and prayers. But beneath them all lay the unspoken truth. The bride's dread was not a failing of her courage, but the very outcome the system produced. The dread of the medieval wedding night was not only spiritual, nor merely the humiliation of public ritual. It was also the fear of the body itself, the pain that awaited, the blood that marked the passage, and the looming spectre of pregnancy, which hung over every bride like a shadow even before the bed curtains were drawn. For many women, the wedding night was their first encounter with physical intimacy. They came to the chamber with little knowledge, often no preparation, and heavy warnings from mothers or companions. Whispers passed in kitchens and weaving rooms painted the night not as a moment of tenderness, but as an ordeal. "It will hurt," they said. "There will be blood." The words clung like chains, leaving the bride trembling before anything had yet happened. And in truth, those whispers were not exaggerations. The act was often painful, sometimes violently so, made worse by fear, inexperience, and the indifference of a husband taught that this was his right. Medical texts of the time, written by men and for men, offered little comfort. They spoke clinically of virginity as a barrier to be broken, a seal to be torn. Some compared it to unlocking a door, others to cutting a knot. Rarely did they consider the feelings of the woman herself. To them, her pain was not a problem, it was proof. Blood on the sheets was not tragedy, but evidence, demanded by law and custom. And so, the bride's suffering was transformed into spectacle, her pain into contract. Imagine the chamber on that night. The guests have left, the prayers have faded, the bed is heavy with embroidered sheets. The groom approaches, perhaps nervous, perhaps impatient. The bride lies still, her heart pounding, her hands trembling against the linen. She knows that outside the door, family and servants linger, waiting for proof that she has bled. The very fabric of the bed may be inspected the next morning. For her, pain is not only inevitable, it is required. To fail to bleed could spark whispers, doubts, accusations of impurity. The sheets themselves became witnesses, silent judges of her virtue. Beyond the pain, there was fear of what might follow. Pregnancy was not a possibility, it was an expectation. In medieval society, a woman's worth was measured by her fertility, her ability to bear children for her husband's line. And yet, pregnancy was also perilous. In some regions, as many as 1 in 3 women died from complications of childbirth. Every pregnancy carried risk of fever, bleeding, infection. For the bride, the wedding night was not simply the beginning of married life. It was the beginning of a cycle that could end in death. Consider how young many brides were. Some as young as 14, scarcely past childhood themselves, were expected to conceive quickly. Their bodies, not yet fully grown, faced immense dangers. Doctors of the time knew little of anatomy, less of hygiene, and almost nothing of safe childbirth. To be a bride was to walk a path lined with funerals of mothers, sisters, friends. Every kiss, every touch, carried with it the memory of women buried too soon. Even those who survived childbirth bore scars. Records tell of women weakened permanently, left unable to walk properly, or suffering from injuries that medicine could not heal. These stories were not secrets, they were well known, passed in hushed voices among women. When a bride lay in her marriage bed on that first night, she was not only fearing the act itself, she was fearing the years of pregnancy and childbirth that stretched ahead, each one another gamble with her life. The physical fear was made worse by lack of agency. Few brides had the power to delay, to speak, or to refuse. Husbands were taught to take what was theirs, and the church blessed that right. Even when a bride wept or resisted, her voice was drowned by doctrine and law. Pain was not a reason to pause. It was a sign that everything was proceeding as it should. The very things that frightened her most were interpreted as evidence of success. And so, the dread deepened. A trembling girl entered her chamber, knowing that she must endure pain to prove her worth, and then risk death to fulfill her role. The chamber was not only a room for love, it was the threshold of suffering disguised as duty. History does not give us her voice directly. But if you close your eyes and imagine the silence of that chamber, you can almost hear the questions she might have whispered into the dark. Why must proof require pain? Why must her life be wagered on the altar of fertility? Why was obedience called holy while fear was called sin? Tonight, as you drift further into this story, consider this. When the very first night of marriage demanded both blood and silence, what hope was left for love to bloom? If the church sanctified fear and the body trembled with dread, society at large ensured that this suffering did not remain private. For medieval women, the wedding night was not only a personal ordeal, but also a spectacle woven into the fabric of community life. Pain and humiliation were transformed into custom, and custom into entertainment. The bedding ceremony, already heavy with ritual, often spilled over into mockery. Guests, sometimes drunk from the feast, followed the couple with laughter and bawdy jokes. They teased the bride openly, sang songs of crude humor, and shouted suggestions that turned her anxiety into public amusement. In some accounts, they would tug at her gown, push her toward the bed, or make loud remarks about what was to come. For the men and women outside the bed, it was entertainment. For the bride inside it, it was terror disguised as tradition. In noble courts, the spectacle could be even worse. Chroniclers describe instances where kings and lords demanded proof of consummation before they would recognize the marriage as valid. Sheets were displayed, blood was shown, and sometimes attendants remained in the room until the act began. A bride who hesitated faced not compassion, but ridicule. Her pain was treated as comedy, her silence as shyness, her tears as weakness. What she endured became gossip that would ripple through the hall the next morning. Imagine the contradiction. By day, poets sang of courtly love, knights pledged their devotion, and minstrels told tales of ladies cherished above all else. But by night, in the chamber of marriage, those same ladies were stripped of dignity. The songs of love ended at the threshold, replaced by drunken laughter and the demand for evidence. Romance and reality did not meet. They collided, and it was the bride who bore the cost. Even among peasants, where ceremonies were simpler, the community still hovered over the chamber door. Villagers waited outside, listening for sounds, joking about what might happen. In some places, they beat drums or rattled pots to encourage the couple, turning the night into carnival. For the woman within, there was no space to breathe, no chance to hide. Her fear was amplified by the knowledge that her neighbors were listening, waiting to turn her pain into story. What is most striking is how normalized this was. Chronicles record it without horror, as though it were natural. The humiliation of the bride was not seen as cruelty, but as part of festivity. Pain was not a tragedy, it was proof of purity. Blood on sheets was not private, it was public evidence. In this way, society erased the line between bedroom and stage, between intimacy and performance. In quiet corners, resistance lingered. Some brides fainted before the act began, delaying what was expected. Others prayed loudly, stretching out the ritual until guests grew bored and left. A few families whispered warnings, advising daughters to endure the first night in silence but to find their own strength later. These small rebellions rarely entered the chronicles, but they lived on in whispered stories, tiny acts of defiance against a system that demanded pain as proof. For the bride who lay trembling behind drawn curtains, there was no comfort in knowing that her fear was shared by countless others. Society had transformed that fear into entertainment, and laughter echoed outside her chamber, even as tears fell inside it. What was sacred had become spectacle, and what was suffering had become proof. Tonight, as you rest in the quiet of your own room, consider this. When an entire community turns fear into ritual and pain into laughter, how does a single voice of protest survive? Silence on the medieval wedding night was more than the absence of words. It was the measure of virtue, the expectation of family, the command of the church, and the survival strategy of women who understood that sound itself could betray them. To remain quiet was praised as obedience. To cry out was dismissed as weakness. To resist was condemned as sin. Through sermons, customs, and laws, silence became both shield and chain, leaving women trapped in a paradox. Their endurance was praised only when it erased their voice. From the moment they were children, girls were shaped by lessons that prized silence. In noble households, conduct manuals, painstakingly copied in monastic script, advised daughters to lower their eyes and let their husbands lead. Proverbs whispered by mothers over the hearth warned them that talkative women brought ruin, while quiet wives were blessed by God. Even in villages, songs sung while weaving or grinding grain reminded women that virtue lay in keeping peace and swallowing words. By the time a bride approached her wedding night, these lessons had burrowed so deep that silence was no longer a choice. It was a reflex. The wedding night demanded this silence most cruelly. Guests laughed outside the chamber door. Servants whispered nearby. Priests had blessed the bed with holy water. Every sound the bride made could echo into judgment. A gasp of pain might be repeated at the morning feast. A sob might be carried into village gossip. A refusal might be remembered in court. Silence, then, was not only protection, it was demanded as evidence that the marriage had unfolded without complaint, a phrase that appears again and again in the records of the time. Church doctrine reinforced the hush. Priests preached that a wife's body belonged to her husband, and to deny him was to deny God's order. Confession turned fear into guilt, transforming even a bride's reluctance into sin that required forgiveness. Silence was sanctified as holy endurance. Women who endured quietly were praised as models of obedience, while those who protested risked being branded disobedient or worse. Possessed, law added its own weight. In disputes over annulment, courts asked not about the bride's tears, but about her silence. Was the consummation performed without protest? Did anyone hear her voice raised in refusal? Witnesses, physicians, and midwives testified about sheets and blood, but rarely about words. To be quiet was to make the contract binding. To speak was to risk unraveling everything: dowry, alliance, honor. And so, women learned that silence was safer than truth. Within the chamber, silence was filled with hidden struggle. Some brides clenched their fists until their nails cut the skin, preferring pain in their hands to sound on their lips. Others bit down on linen, muffling their cries so that the bed itself bore witness. A few fainted under strain, their bodies collapsing into temporary escape. Diaries, rare but precious, leave fleeting glimpses of this endurance. A line about trembling, a mention of sleepless nights, a prayer scribbled for mercy. These fragments remind us that silence did not mean peace. It meant survival. The expectation of silence reached beyond that first night. At the dawn meal, the bride was expected to smile, to accept congratulations, to carry herself as though joy had filled the chamber. No mention of pain was permitted. Even if she limped, even if her eyes were swollen from tears, her role was to appear content. Family honor demanded her composure. Community pride demanded her poise. Her silence was required not only in the bed, but at the table, in the church, in the fields. The difference between noble and peasant women was only in setting, not in essence. In castles, silence was masked by ceremony. A bride might be dressed in embroidered linen, a crucifix placed above her bed, a priest's blessing lingering in the air. But her silence was still demanded, her voice still dangerous. In cottages, the surroundings were rougher: straw pallets, wooden walls, neighbors gossiping outside. Yet here too, women knew that complaint would bring only ridicule. Whether under silk or under straw, silence was the same burden. The irony is that silence itself became twisted into proof of success. Chroniclers describe marriages as peaceful, When the bride was quiet, courts recorded consummations without protest as binding, and families interpreted the absence of complaint as evidence of satisfaction. Silence was read not as fear, but as consent. The truth hidden beneath, the clenched fists, the bitten lips, the fainting, was invisible to those who preferred not to see, and still, silence echoed. It passed from one generation to the next. A mother who had endured quietly advised her daughter to do the same. A friend who had swallowed tears reminded another bride to keep her voice down. Over centuries, this invisible inheritance built an unbroken chain of muteness, one that bound women together even as it erased their individual voices. But silence, though heavy, was never empty. It carried with it stories that we can sense even now. The chronicles may not have written their cries, but in the absence we hear them. The hush that lingers in medieval court records, in sermons, in proverbs, is not the hush of peace. It is the hush of voices buried. Tonight, as you listen in the safety of your own room, ask yourself, when silence is demanded as virtue, how many truths vanish into the dark, leaving only the echo of what should have been spoken? Fear on the wedding night did not look the same in every household. The weight of silence, the pressure of ritual, and the expectation of obedience pressed heavily on all women, but its shape shifted with rank, wealth, and circumstance. To compare the experiences of noble brides and peasant brides is to see how the same dread wore different masks, how suffering could be draped in silk or hidden in straw, and how status never freed women from the same web of expectation. In castles and noble halls, the bedding ceremony was a grand performance. Torches lit the corridors as guests accompanied the couple to the bedchamber. The bride's gown, heavy with embroidery and jewels, was carefully removed piece by piece while attendants looked on. Priests stood ready to sprinkle holy water on the sheets. Relics were placed above the bed, and the marriage bed itself might be a towering structure draped in rich fabric. Nobility wrapped intimacy in ceremony, but ceremony did not protect the bride. It only magnified her exposure. The higher her station, the more eyes judged her, the more mouths whispered about her success, and the more political weight rested on her silence. A noble bride carried alliances on her shoulders. Her body was the site where treaties were sealed, where family honor was measured, where dynasties secured heirs. Failure to consummate the marriage was not merely personal, it could be a diplomatic disaster. Annulments at noble courts were argued with the same intensity as wars, because marriages were themselves a kind of warfare, fought with dowries and bloodlines. For the bride, this meant that her trembling in the chamber could ripple outward into kingdoms. She was not only a woman, she was a contract embodied, a battlefield veiled in silk. Peasant brides lived a different ritual, stripped of grandeur but not of fear. Instead of embroidered gowns, they wore their best linen, perhaps with a wreath of flowers in their hair. Instead of towering canopied beds, they lay on straw pallets or rough wooden frames. Instead of relics and priests, they faced neighbors gathered outside, rattling pots or singing crude songs to encourage the consummation. Here too, the chamber was never private. The community demanded proof, and proof meant pain. Gossip traveled quickly through villages, so a bride's cries or her silence would become a story retold around firesides for years. The difference between noble and peasant women was one of scale, not of essence. Nobles faced political scrutiny. Peasants faced communal ridicule. Nobles feared annulment and disgrace in courts. Peasants feared being mocked in taverns or markets. Both faced the same expectation: to bleed, to be silent, to endure. Whether surrounded by silk curtains or rough-hewn walls, women entered the same ordeal with different audiences waiting outside their door. Yet subtle contrasts emerge when we look closer. Noble brides sometimes had attendants who might shield them, whisper advice, or even smuggle herbs meant to ease pain. In rare cases, noble women wielded enough influence to negotiate with their husbands, at least over time. A peasant bride had no such protections. Her husband was often older, sometimes chosen by her parents to settle debts or strengthen kin ties. Her voice was even smaller, her silence more absolute. And while noble women risked scandal in courts, peasant women risked physical violence at home if they resisted. Both paths led to fear, but the walls that contained it differed. Consider two chambers on the same night. In one, a bride sits beneath a canopy embroidered with golden thread, while guests wait in the hall to hear word of success. In another, a girl lies on straw in a one-room cottage, while neighbours outside laugh and bang pots. The details differ: the gold thread, the straw, the laughter, the gossip, but the core is the same. Each bride stares at the ceiling in dread. Each grips the bedclothes in silence. Each knows that her suffering is not hers alone, but belongs to the people outside. History, however, recorded noble fears more readily. Chronicles detailed the scandals of queens and duchesses whose marriages failed, whose sheets bore no proof, whose annulments shook kingdoms. Peasant voices rarely reached parchment. Their silences were passed only through stories, folklore, and song. And so, when we read of fear, it is often draped in velvet, even though it lived just as sharply in cottages. The absence of peasant testimony is not the absence of their pain. It is only the absence of scribes who cared to write it down. The common thread between noble and peasant alike was that fear was normalized. Both were taught that silence was virtue. Both were told that pain was proof. Both were left without voice in chronicles and sermons. The trappings of wealth could not soften the weight of expectation, and the poverty of peasants did not diminish its cruelty. The wedding night, whether staged in castles or cottages, was not a night of love. It was a night of endurance. Tonight, as you reflect on the different halls and homes of the medieval world, ask yourself, if fear binds all women alike, does rank ever truly protect, or does it simply gild the same chain? By the time night fell on a medieval wedding, fear had already been woven into ritual. Silence had been sanctified, and the bride had been prepared to endure. Yet what may shock us most is not simply that women trembled in the chamber. It is that their dread was treated as normal, even expected. Pain became proof, silence became virtue, and humiliation became entertainment. In this way, society transformed terror into custom and suffering into tradition. Guests played their part in this cruel theatre. At noble courts, chroniclers describe feasts that ended with bawdy songs and jokes about the bride's innocence. Guests accompanied the couple with torches, shouting encouragements laced with innuendo. Some lingered outside the chamber to listen. Others demanded proof in the morning. Bloodstained sheets held aloft as evidence of virtue. The entire household, from noble lords to lowly servants, seemed invested in whether the bride's pain had been sufficient to mark success. What should have been private was paraded as performance. Among peasants, the rituals were less gilded, but no less invasive. Neighbours rattled pots, sang crude rhymes, and sometimes even pounded on the walls of the cottage to encourage consummation. The bride's fear became a festival, her tears drowned out by laughter. For men and women outside, it was amusement. For the bride inside, it was dread magnified. Her private ordeal turned into public comedy. Folk songs from the period confirm how deeply normalized this was. Verses celebrated the moment a husband tamed his bride, mocking her fear as part of the entertainment. Proverbs warned that a silent bride was a good bride, while a resistant one was wild. These sayings carved dread into cultural memory, teaching communities that suffering was not tragedy, but tradition. The church, though cloaked in solemnity, reinforced this view. Priests preached that a wife's endurance was holy. They reminded women that obedience in the chamber was their duty before God. And so, what began as private fear was sanctified as virtue, and what should have been compassion was replaced with blessing for endurance. Even agony was wrapped in prayer. Imagine the chamber on such a night. The candles flicker low. Outside, laughter echoes in corridors or across fields. Inside, the bride lies trembling, knowing that her pain is expected, that her silence will be praised, that her suffering will be retold as a tale of proof. She understands that tomorrow, her sheets may be displayed, her endurance measured, her body transformed into evidence. The weight of expectation presses heavier than the bedclothes. For centuries, this normalization silenced women. If fear was expected, who would listen when they spoke of terror? If pain was praised, who would care when they suffered? If silence was called holy, who would believe their cries? In this way, the wedding night became not only an ordeal, but a lesson that carried into marriage itself. Suffering was natural, silence was survival, and resistance was sin. In whispers and fragments, defiance lingered. Some women wrote prayers in margins of books, asking for mercy not only from God, but from men. Others shared herbs that promised to ease pain. Small gifts passed secretly between friends. A few refused outright, their names surviving in scandalous chronicles. These rare sparks remind us that not all women accepted the story, even when society demanded their fear. Tonight, as you rest in a world where silence is no longer forced in the same way, consider this. When an entire culture laughs at suffering and calls it normal, how many voices are lost before anyone notices the silence? The dread of the medieval wedding night did not vanish with the dawn. For many women, it was only the beginning of a longer fear, one that extended through months of uncertainty, years of duty, and the looming spectre of childbirth. What happened behind the bed curtains was not an isolated ordeal, but the threshold of a lifetime shaped by expectations of silence, endurance, and submission. From the moment a marriage was consummated, society turned its gaze toward fertility. A bride was expected to conceive quickly, to prove her body's usefulness as a vessel for heirs, workers, or alliances. In noble households, her womb became a political tool, her children proof of dynastic strength. Among peasants, her pregnancies filled the fields with laborers, ensured the survival of the family, and bound her more tightly to her husband's kin. The wedding night was only step one in a cycle that could continue for decades. But pregnancy was not joy without shadow. Medieval women knew well the dangers. They saw mothers die in childbirth, sisters buried too young, neighbors carried away by fever. Mortality loomed over every pregnancy, sometimes claiming 1 in 3 women of childbearing age. Childbirth was less a miracle than a gamble, each labor a roll of dice against death. A wedding night that ended in conception was both a fulfillment of duty and the beginning of a dangerous journey. The church, while sanctifying motherhood as holy, offered little comfort. Priests preached that suffering in childbirth was Eve's curse, punishment inherited by all women. Pain was framed as penance, danger as divine will. Even when women begged for mercy, their cries were wrapped in theology rather than medicine. Midwives offered herbs, charms, and whispered prayers, but the risk remained. A bride entering her marriage bed knew that she might be entering a cycle of repeated peril, where her body became battlefield after battlefield. Fear extended into daily life. Once a woman was marked as wife, her autonomy shrank further. Her husband controlled land, income, and household decisions. In many regions, he could beat her with little consequence if she resisted. Courts favored men, and the church advised women to submit in silence. The wedding night's lesson, that her voice was dangerous, her pain irrelevant, echoed in every corner of marriage. To resist was sin, to complain was shame, and to endure was virtue. Consider the long shadows of that lesson. A bride who had been forced into silence on her wedding night often carried that silence into every childbirth that followed. She bit her lips during labor, whispering prayers rather than cries, fearing that complaint might mark her as unholy. She rose from her bed after nights of fear, pretending to be content, because that was what her family expected. She sat at feasts and smiled, because that was what society demanded. Silence became the rhythm of her life. Each unspoken word another thread in the tapestry of endurance. The difference between noble and peasant women remained, but the core was unchanged. A queen might fear that failure to bear sons would endanger a dynasty. A peasant woman might fear that failure to produce workers would starve her family. Both lay awake with the same dread, that their bodies were not truly theirs, that their lives balanced on expectations they could not escape. Some women resisted in small ways. A noble woman might plead illness to delay her husband. A peasant woman might whisper her fear to a friend at the well. A few sought charms from midwives or carried talismans against pregnancy. These acts of defiance were fragile, often hidden, but they reveal a truth. Even in silence, women sought to reclaim fragments of control. But the larger pattern endured. Society normalized fear so deeply that it became invisible. Brides were expected to tremble, wives were expected to suffer, mothers were expected to risk death. Silence was praised as obedience, and obedience was praised as holiness. The echo of that first night did not fade. It reverberated through a lifetime. Imagine her years later, no longer a young bride, but a weary mother of several children. Her hands are rough from labor, her body scarred by births. She remembers her wedding night, not as the beginning of joy, but as the moment her voice was buried. She sits in silence by the hearth, listening to her daughters laugh, and wonders if they too will learn to quiet their voices on the night when silence is demanded once again. Tonight, as you think about the long arc of fear stretching from one night into an entire life, ask yourself, if a woman learns to silence her cries from the very first night of marriage, how many generations carry the weight of that silence forward? The terror that began behind the curtains did not dissolve with the candle smoke. It drifted into the corridors of marriage and settled into a routine, a choreography of days and nights that taught two people how to live together while teaching one of them how to disappear. The first night served as a template. If silence had been praised then, silence would be praised tomorrow. If pain had been read as proof then, pain would be read as duty in the years ahead. And if obedience had been clothed in holiness then, obedience would become the fabric of the household, woven into mealtimes and harvests, into prayers and debts, into the sigh a woman hid as she lifted the latch every evening. Canon lawyers spoke of debitum conjugal, the conjugal debt, as a mutual obligation, a balance that supposedly bound husband and wife to care for each other's bodies. On parchment, the rule gleamed with symmetry. In rooms with real doors and real beds, the symmetry tilted. A husband invoked duty. A wife shouldered guilt. Confessors told women that refusal stained the soul. The vocabulary of balance became a set of weights that always fell on the same side of the scale. When a woman felt ill, she was urged to pray and endure. When a man felt thwarted, he was urged to insist with charity. Charity often ended at the threshold. Households learned to encode the rule into furniture and habits. The bed sat like a throne no one admitted was a throne. The chest at the foot of it guarded linens and secrets alike. The hours after supper belonged to chores that could be lengthened or shortened, depending on who wished to delay and who wished to hurry. A wife who needed time to breathe scrubbed the copper pot longer, or swept the hearth twice, or braided her hair with the slow care of a craftswoman. The gestures were small, almost invisible. Small, almost invisible things can add up to a survival. In noble houses, the code wore silk. A lady retreated behind a screen to pray when prayer meant she needed space from a husband whose temper had grown rough. An attendant learned to arrive with a tray at particular moments, rescuing her mistress without naming the rescue. A steward arranged hunts and audiences to keep the Lord out of doors on the days when a physician had warned of danger. Compassion moved through the household like a courier who knew which stairs creaked and which servants could be trusted. It could not change the law, but it could blunt the edge of obedience. In cottages, the code wore wool and wood smoke. A peasant woman learned the sound of her husband's boots in mud and could tell, by that sound alone, whether to be near the door or near the cradle. Neighbors brought news across fences with the tact of veterans. "Brew is strong tonight," a friend might say, meaning, keep the lamp low and the children close. A midwife lived at the bend of the lane with a drawer of herbs and a memory full of births. She knew how to ease a cramp, soften a scar, lighten a mood. She also knew when to speak and when to knot her mouth shut against a man who thought kindness made him foolish. The church's presence remained constant. Confession boxes heard the same doubts year after year. I fear. I am tired. I cannot bear another pregnancy. I flinch when the candle is snuffed. The answers varied little. Pray more. Resist temptation. Find patience. Accept the cross assigned to you. Sometimes a compassionate priest counseled abstinence during illness, or lent a book of devotions that taught the body to rest. Sometimes a stern priest spoke of Eve and penance. The woman went home holding both a blessing and a sentence she could not appeal. Law offered narrow paths for the desperate. A wife who could prove grave cruelty might seek separatio, a mensa et thoro, separation from table and bed, while the marriage bond remained. This required witnesses who would speak, a family willing to pay fees, a court that took her seriously. Few could step onto that road. Fewer still reached its end. And if she returned home without relief, the price of having tried could be counted in bruises, and in the sudden way neighbors fell silent when she passed the well. Time itself became a teacher. The first winter taught which logs smoked and which carried heat. The second winter taught which words smoldered and which burned. After 3 winters, a wife knew how to place the candle so that its light made the room seem warmer and smaller, a pocket of air where gentleness had a chance. She learned to predict when a storm in the fields would become a storm in the bedchamber, and she built a shelter of tact and timing. She kept a sprig of rue beside the comb. She folded the good linen with care because she needed one thing in the day that obeyed her hands. Children changed the map again. A cradle between 2 bodies can be a shield. It can also be a reminder that shields do not stop time. After a birth, a wife remained sore and frightened of the next summons. Midwives whispered about spacing, about herbs that might slow the cycle, about the months when bodies needed quiet. Some husbands listened when hands guided breath and eyes met without fear. Some did not. A woman's tactics had to be lighter than air and stronger than rope at the same time. Letters, where they exist, reveal marriage spoken sideways. A noble woman writes to a brother about the northern wind that keeps her indoors, and the brother understands the reply must be an invitation for her husband to hunt at his estate. A merchant's wife slips a note to a cousin about the quality of flour, and the cousin sends a sack with a sprig of herb tucked deep in the grain. A widow writes to a goddaughter that God gives different kinds of courage, and she underlines the word different with a hand that has learned to press the quill without tearing the page. Songs carried messages the way rivers carry silt. One ballad told of a wife who sang the names of tools while she worked, adze, plane, all, and the melody made a promise her husband learned to keep. Work first, warmth later. In another valley, women sang a cradle tune with an extra bar only they added, a bar that meant, leave her be tonight. Men hummed it without hearing the extra beat. The power of coded music is the power to survive inside the rules while bending them without noise. Not every marriage was a prison. There were husbands who learned that tenderness brings its own harvest. There were homes where the lesson of the first night was overwritten by years of patience. A girl who had stared at the ceiling in fear became a woman who closed her eyes because she felt safe. These stories rarely made it into chronicles because joy does not scandalize, and scribes reach for scandal the way bees reach for sugar. Even so, the furniture in such houses grew polished by different hands. The stool near the window wore the shape of evenings spent reading aloud. The blanket at the foot of the bed remembered winter mornings when children climbed under it like puppies. The chamber was still a chamber, but it was not an armory. Still, for many, the pattern held. Obedience as habit, quiet as proof, duty as a wheel that spun regardless of weather. A wife measured the seasons by the weight of her skirts and the distance between pregnancies. The body became a ledger. Nights were entries. Mornings were receipts. Harvests were the auditor no one could bribe. When illness came, she bargained with saints and with common sense. asking for time to heal before the wheel turned again. Sometimes she won a week, sometimes a month. Sometimes the bargain failed, and the village baked bread without her recipe while the churchyard learned a new name. Age shifted the balance. A woman with grey at her temples found a different tone in her own voice. Daughters watched her and learned a posture that could slow a man's step without being called defiance. Sons watched her and learned that a mother's gaze can be a wall a father does not cross. Widows discovered that the law treated them with a dignity marriage had not provided. Property in their own hands felt like a language finally spoken aloud. Some widows never remarried. They managed shops, vineyards, or small plots and gave advice from the tall-backed chair near the hearth. Visitors said she had grown stern. What she had grown was audible. Across regions, the details shifted like dialect. In one bishopric, a priest might counsel abstinence during Lent and Advent and after childbirth, giving a woman a calendar she could wield as shield. In another, a priest might wave off such counsel and speak of duty in tones that left no room. In some towns, guild statutes protected wives from drunken husbands for a night or two each week. In others, a woman's bruises were treated as a household's private reign. Geography was a second marriage no one chose, a union with the map that could turn mercy into custom or grind it into dust. The material world kept score. Linen told truths people refused to say. A seamstress could tell from a tear where a hand had grabbed. A laundress could tell from a stain which remedy had failed. The women who touched cloth all day carried knowledge once reserved for physicians, and they traded that knowledge in whispers that felt like warmth on cold mornings. When they gathered at the riverbank, the splash of the beta stones covered more than dirt. It covered counsel, comfort, and the names of midwives who did not ask questions they could not afford to answer. Sometimes hope announced itself in odd disguises. A new spinning wheel that made work faster, leaving an hour for a walk at dusk. A neighbor who built a better latch, making the door close softly instead of slamming. A priest transferred to another parish, and the one who replaced him spoke of kindness as if it were doctrine. Tiny changes look like nothing from a distance. Up close, they feel like air when a window is opened after a long winter. If there is a single sentence that explains how fear of one night becomes the architecture of a life, it is this. People repeat what is rewarded. Families praised quiet wives, so quiet persisted. Priests praised obedient wives, so obedience became a kind of currency. Communities mocked women who spoke, so speech went indoors and learned to move like a cat. Institutions did not need to knock loudly. They only needed to nod in approval when a woman swallowed a word. Nods are powerful things. Picture her years after the wedding, sitting on a stool by the door to let the last of the evening air settle on her skin. The fields are dark. The house is quiet, except for the scratch of a mouse in the bin and a child turning in sleep. She remembers the first night as a shape, not a story. She can describe the canopy embroidery, but not the sentences she did not speak. She can describe the weight of the quilt, but not the way her lungs learned to hold their breath. She cannot calculate how many decisions since then have been made in a voice barely above a whisper. She knows only that the whisper has carried her this far. She lifts the latch and closes the door softly so as not to wake anyone. The latch answers with a small sound that feels tonight like a word. In a world that rewarded quiet and obedience, some women still carved out rooms where their own voices held sway. The garden, the market stall, the space beside the cradle, the workbench where thread and time bow to skill. In those rooms, they taught daughters to read winds and faces, taught sons to value gentleness, taught neighbors that a favor done at the right moment can be a fortress. None of this undid the first night. Much of it reshaped the nights that followed. So the question returns, not to the chamber, but to the house that grew around it. If an entire marriage can be trained by the silence of a single beginning, what would happen if one brave sentence, plain, careful, undeniable, was spoken out loud and answered with care? The dread of the medieval wedding night did not end at the threshold. It spilled outward into halls, lanes, and marketplaces, until the bride's most private hour became a story owned by everyone else. Fear was rehearsed by custom, directed by clergy, scored by musicians, and performed before audiences that pretended to bless while they stared. What began as trembling behind curtains turned into a public script repeated across decades, villages, and courts until pain felt like heritage, and humiliation solidified as civic pride. People convinced themselves they were celebrating a union. What they were truly celebrating was their own authority over a woman's first night. In noble households, the evening rarely faded into quiet. Torches traced gold along carved beams as guests escorted the couple toward the bedchamber in a pageant of noise. Minstrels picked quick tunes, pages carried wine, and someone recited a crude verse that made the room spark with laughter. The bride was expected to smile as if the jest were harmless. Servants hovered with practiced curiosity, ready to notice a glance, a stagger, a gasp that could become tomorrow's tale. Above the bed hung a crucifix, a gleaming relic case, perhaps, a sprig of blessed palm. The objects said protection, the crowd said spectacle. Blessing became the pretext for watching, and watching became a rite. The ritual that followed had many names and shifting edges. In courts, it could be a solemn escort with Latin prayers before the door closed. In other places, it turned rowdy, a mock procession, teasing songs, a tug at laces, hands that moved with the confidence of tradition rather than consent. Attendants remained long enough to tuck the couple beneath embroidered covers, the gesture framed as care. To the bride, the gesture felt like a hand pressing her voice flat. She learned that the more ornate the curtains, the thinner the privacy. The more crowded the corridor, the smaller the room inside. Outside the nobility, the pattern was simpler but sharper. Villagers gathered with pots, pans, and horns to make rough music that rattled shutters and turned sleep into a dare. Children learned the melodies early. Men raised their mugs. Women added verses they had heard since their own girlhoods. The cottage shook with noise as if a storm had wandered down from the hills and anchored itself in the lane. Inside, a girl clutched the linen and tried to breathe in time with the candle. She knew the jokes already. She had laughed at them when they were someone else's sorrow. Now she understood how laughter can be a rope. Mourning extended the performance into record. In great halls, attendants displayed a folded sheet, proclaiming the stain that proved virtue. Fathers nodded, mothers dabbed their eyes, and stewards carried the news through the household as if they were announcing a victory. Among peasants, the proof became rumor. At the well, two neighbors compared notes about who had heard what through thin walls, while a third repeated a verse that made the story simple enough to sing. The evidence, whether cloth or talk, moved, faster than the woman whose body had supplied it. She ate bread at the morning table and listened to her own life being narrated from across the room. Folk culture kept the script memorized. Ballads praised a husband who tamed the bride. Jokes turned fear into punchlines. Proverbs instructed that a quiet woman kept a peaceful home. A scribe embellishing a manuscript for a lord's library doodled figures in the margins. A cowering bride, a grinning groom, a bed with its curtains flung wide. Woodcuts sold at fairs showed similar scenes, the lines thick and jaunty, as if terror deserved a smile. Repetition taught onlookers to mistake cruelty for custom. A story told often enough begins to sound like truth, even when it is only choreography handed down. The church did not invent the laughter, but its blessings made the audience feel righteous while they watched. Priests spoke of duty, of obedience, of holy endurance. The Latin drifted like incense into rafters and settled as permission on the floor. If a woman suffered, the sermon supplied an explanation that kept the structure intact. Suffering purified, acquiescence sanctified. When wounds heal beneath a halo, people learn to thank the light for the marks it leaves. Under that glow, the exhibition of sheets looked like piety rather than curiosity, and the noise outside a cottage sounded like community rather than intrusion. Women answered the performance in the only spaces left to them: whispers, lullabies, the language of work. Around hearths, they told cautionary tales, that looked like fables but contained maps. In cradles, they sang melodies with hidden bars that taught daughters where to place breath when fear tightened the chest. At the riverbank, they traded recipes for herbal teas wrapped in brown paper, each bundle labeled with a glance. A bride who had endured learned to shape her story without saying it aloud. She taught by gesture, by timing, by the way she blew out a candle halfway rather than all at once. The spectacle trained memory. Years later, the same woman might stand in a doorway during Harvest Festival and hear a group of boys drum a familiar rhythm on a barrel. The sound broke open the old script in her body. Noise outside, command inside, proof in the morning. She smiled for the sake of the day and steered the children toward a gentler game, but the echo stayed. Culture writes with rhythms first and words second. Undoing a rhythm takes a lifetime and the patient work of many hands. Even the objects of the night learned their parts. The bed became a witness, the sheet a contract, the candlestick a judge. The door, which might have been a shield, turned into a drum for knuckles. Curtains swallowed sound, but delivered it back as rumour. The chamber looked ordinary at noon, a room with a chest and a chair. By midnight, it was a set, the furniture props, the air itself an audience waiting to applaud. What makes a spectacle powerful is the promise that everyone belongs to it. Guests in a hall and villagers in a lane felt part of something grand, as if their noise completed the sacrament. Participation disguised accountability. No single voice had to claim the cruelty. The crowd wore it collectively like a festival cloak. When everyone laughs, who is responsible for the tear? When the whole lane sings, who apologizes for the bruised? Silence behind one door. There were places where custom bent. Some towns barred rough music after deaths in childbirth. A few lords banned the display of sheets, declaring that honor did not need proof. In one parish, an aging priest preached that joy requires gentleness and sent guests home early with a blessing that sounded suspiciously like a dismissal. Changes like these announce themselves in footnotes rather than headlines, but footnotes alter how a page is read. A girl grew up under one of those footnotes and learned to measure love by quiet rather than by applause. The bride's understanding shifted through the day. Before the feast, she rehearsed the smiles expected of her. During the procession, she measured the faces around her like landmarks on a dangerous road. At the chamber door, she felt the press of the world at her back and the weight of a new life ahead. Inside, she counted the stitches in the canopy to steady her breath. Afterward, if she could not sleep, she placed her palm against the cool wall and told herself that stone remembers everything and breath is a form of prayer. Mourning did not restore ownership. The first person to speak of the night was rarely the woman who lived it. Someone else carried the account into public. The steward, the washer of linens, the neighbour who had stood by the hedge, the boy who had run errands and collected snippets of sentences as if they were coins. By midday, the narrative had been told and retold so completely that the bride felt she had missed her own story and was only listening now for the ending others preferred. Even when communities convinced themselves that the performance blessed marriages, the arithmetic ran the other way. Noise taught men they were owed an audience for their power. Noise taught women they would be watched more closely when they were most afraid. The ritual forged a pact that linked attention to obedience, surveillance to silence. A practice that called itself communal unity, delivered private isolation to the person at its center. Some resistances were so small they looked like accidents. A candle sputtered out at a fortunate moment. A latch stuck long enough for a meddling cousin to give up. A musician switched to a hymn and shamed the crowd into quiet. A hound barked in the courtyard and drew the pack of gawkers outside. Luck is a clumsy name for 1,000 choices made by people who wish to help without being noticed. Years later, when daughters asked cautious questions, mothers answered with stories about saints who rest or rivers that run slower under snow. The metaphors did their work. A girl learned that a prayer could be a boundary, that a calendar could be a shield, that a song could be a key. She practiced the skill of hearing what was meant rather than what was said. Under such tutelage, agency traveled in disguise and arrived intact. None of this erased the harm of the spectacle. It softened edges. It saved hours. It turned some nights from knives into needles. Even a needle pierces. But a pierced seam can be mended, and a mended seam can hold a life together through many winters. Women did not mistake endurance for justice. They learned to build rooms within rooms where dignity could sit down and take off its shoes. The question lingers like the last chord after a song. When a community teaches itself to laugh at the most vulnerable hour of a single life and calls that laughter tradition, what truth can possibly be heard beneath the noise? Fear in the medieval world did not remain confined to a single night, a single door, or a single pair of witnesses. It moved from body to body the way breath moves through a winter room. Visible for a moment, then gone to the eye, but still there, warming and cooling the air. Mothers learned its weight, then placed that weight carefully into a daughter's hands, calling it prudence, calling it caution, calling it love. In that exchange, a private dread became an inheritance, wrapped in customs, carried by stories, and set down quietly on the table with the bread. In cottages, instruction began with small, precise tasks. A mother showed her daughter how to trim the lamp so the flame would not gutter. She explained that a steady flame draws softer shadows, and softer shadows keep the mind from running to cliffs. She taught how to bank the hearth so embers last until dawn, because waking to a cold room can make the heart gallop. These lessons were delivered as household wisdom, and the girl nodded, believing she was learning only how to keep a tidy home. Years later, she would recall the careful way the wick was pinched and understand that her mother had been teaching something else, how to shepherd a frightened body back toward ordinary light. Some warnings hid inside posture. Keep your chin level, the mother said, and your shoulders open but not wide. Stand where the light touches your face, because light makes truth look less like defiance. Do not twist your hands where others can see. Breathe from the ribs, as if the body were a bellows you can settle with thought. The daughter practiced in the doorway with a basket on her arm while her mother adjusted invisible threads. Move here, pause there, until composure fit like a garment she could put on without thinking. Among the titled, instruction wore silk and theology. A lady of rank pressed a small reliquary into her daughter's palm and named the saint whose bone lay inside. She explained which psalm steadies the breath and which prayer is suitable for fear that will not speak its name. An old nurse who had seen 3 generations of brides whispered a different curriculum entirely. How to speak softly without surrender, how to set a tray where it blocks a rude approach, how to turn a question into a delay long enough for help to arrive. In the corridor beyond the antechamber, women promised each other practical mercy. Stories did the rest. At the long table, elders told of queens who refused and were ruined, of maidens who bent and were praised. A father might recite a romance in which love conquers, while the mother's voice at the spinning wheel carried tales that lasted. A girl who learned to read the weather in a man's walk. A bride who hid a sprig of rue in her sleeve and lived, long enough to teach 3 daughters where to plant theirs. The narratives stacked like timber, some decorative, some load-bearing. A child could not always tell which was which, until the roof she stood under kept out the rain. Ritual made the inheritance visible. On the evening before a wedding, older women braided the bride's hair with knots that had names: blessing, patience, safe return. Some knots promised courage, others promised delay. An herb might be tucked beneath a ribbon, a leaf for steady nerves, a root for quiet sleep. The gestures looked like beauty and smelled like the garden, but a grandmother's eyes grew distant while her hands worked, as if she were tying memory itself into the braid, so the girl would not have to carry all of it alone. Practical counsel traveled alongside devotion. A mother explained the logic of doors and thresholds, where to stand when a latch lifts, how to step back without looking like retreat, which stool can be nudged with a foot to redirect a path. She advised that supper can be slowed if the stew is stirred a little longer, and that a second ladle of broth offered to a partner can become a request for gentleness without having to use the risky word gentle. She taught which errands to volunteer and which to decline. These instructions sound like choreography because they are choreography. They teach the body to move so that the house itself becomes an ally when nerves are thin. None of this arrived as a lecture. It came as seasoning, sprinkled on the day. The instructions hid inside talk of grain and washing, saints' days and weather. They were not universal. Every household wrote its own small book of hours, annotated in the margins by women who remembered exactly where the text had failed them. If a page had once torn at the seam, they reinforced it with a strip of cloth. If a prayer had not helped, they replaced it with a humming that did. A daughter received the volume without ceremony and only later recognized that she had been entrusted with an edition expanded by experience. There were gifts as well as warnings. A mother might pass her daughter a comb with a smooth back, not because it was pretty, but because its weight feels certain in a trembling hand. She might give a scarf woven thick, explaining that warmth collects at the neck and soothes the pulse. She might press a small vial of oil into a palm, scented with rosemary and something darker, saying only that breath follows scent and comes home when reason cannot persuade it. These tools wore the costumes of luxury and comfort. In truth, they were instruments for steering the body towards safety. Folklore offered maps for walking inward. A tale about a river that slows under ice taught patience. A tale about a fox that survives by listening taught attention. A tale about a door that opens only when addressed by its true name taught the value of precise words, spoken aloud if safe, spoken silently if not. Daughters learned that names have edges, and that naming fear carefully can sometimes pin it to the table long enough to trim it down to size. Of course, the inheritance did harm. Each caution took up space where curiosity might have grown. Each practice of stillness strengthened muscles that might have learned to dance more freely. A daughter reached for her voice and found it wrapped, not gagged, but swaddled, protected, so thoroughly she struggled to remember what her own sound felt like in a room. Mothers knew this, and many ached at the trade. They had bought survival with silence, and the price was stamped on the coin they handed down. There were, however, other coins hidden beneath. Some mothers, in the privacy of a garden path or during a long walk to market, told truer stories. They spoke of moments when they had said no, and the world had not ended. Of evenings when kindness arrived unexpectedly and changed the arithmetic. Of days when work and laughter braided themselves into a stronger rope than fear could cut. They shared the names of friends who could be trusted and the hours when a visit could count as duty rather than escape. These sentences felt dangerous and medicinal at once. Imagine a daughter on the last afternoon before her wedding. She helps. Her mother fold linen, aligning corners that refuse to meet. The small mismatch becomes a metaphor she will not forget. Most things almost fit, and a life is the art of smoothing almost into enough. The mother pretends not to see her own hands trembling. She tells a story about a winter when the flour ran low and the village shared, and a different story about a summer when nobody shared at all. She speaks in details: who baked, who helped, who turned away, and the girl understands why the stories include names. Evening brings neighbors with jars of broth and bundles of herbs, laughter hovering just outside the shape of kindness. The daughter takes the gifts and thanks each one by name because names make people accountable to themselves. Later, she sits by the window, where the last light gathers like coins on the sill, and thinks about the stories braided into her hair. She knows she has been taught how to endure. She wonders whether she has been taught how to ask. The two are not the same, and the difference matters. Across town, a noble daughter walks through a gallery where tapestries show hunts and battles she has never seen and never will. Her mother points to a stag and says there is courage in standing still when being chased. The girl smiles because she knows the lesson is not about stags. She has been given a prayer to carry, and a servant has been told to keep a candle burning in a particular window at a particular hour for a particular number of nights. The arrangements look like piety and order. They are also signals. If the candle is lit, certain doors will open. If it is dark, a different plan will unfold. The mother points to a chair near the window and says, "There." Some inheritances crack under their own weight, and that too becomes part of the teaching. An aunt confesses she kept quiet too long. A widow admits the ledger favored her only after the world named her alone. A sister says plainly that caution can save you and also shrink you, and she refuses to pretend one of those truths cancels the other. These sentences do not fit into lullabies. They fit into the spaces between chores, where a daughter can put them in her pocket and feel their shape while carrying water. Years unfold. The daughter becomes a mother, and when her own child asks why the lamp should be trimmed so carefully, she gives a different answer. A steady flame makes the room kinder for everyone, and kindness is how a home remembers its people when they are tired. She still teaches how to stand where the light falls. She also teaches how to move the light. She keeps the old braid, but she loosens 2 knots and ties one anew with a name that did not exist in her mother's day: refuge. When the girl asks what refuge means, the mother points to the strongest chair and the stoutest latch and says, "Learn to brace the door, and to open it when the air needs changing." A chronicle would summarize all this as tradition, as if that word were a chest that could hold both harm and help without breaking a hinge. The lived truth is quieter and more complicated. Inheritance is not a single object traveling down a line. It is a set of tendencies moving with stories, a cloud of gestures hovering over a table, a weather pattern crossing a generation at the speed of a mother's breath. Sometimes the cloud thins and sunlight touches the floorboards. Sometimes the wind returns and the windows rattle. A girl grows up hearing both kinds of weather and becomes the person who decides when to close the shutters and when to throw them wide. What matters, finally, is the question a girl learns to ask herself when she stands at a threshold with her hand on the latch. Is this fear mine, or was it placed here for safekeeping by someone who loved me and lacked better tools? If she can name the answer, even softly, she has begun to choose the portion of inheritance she will carry and the portion she will set down. That choice will not shatter the past. It will, however, change the weather in the room. And that is how new climates begin, breath by breath, door by door. Fear did not exist in a vacuum. By the late Middle Ages, it was reinforced by the very structures that were supposed to guide and protect society: law, medicine, and theology. Each of these institutions shaped how women experienced their wedding nights, turning personal dread into a doctrine sanctioned by authority. What a bride felt privately in the chamber was echoed and justified by the words of priests, the rulings of magistrates, and the prescriptions of physicians. Fear became not only an intimate experience, but also an institutional command. Law was the first chain. In many regions, a marriage was not considered complete until it was consummated. The act itself was proof of union, binding not only hearts, but property, inheritance, and family honor. If a husband claimed that his wife had refused him, he could summon witnesses, present grievances, and even demand annulment or punishment. Courts, dominated by men, often sided with the husband, declaring that the wife had failed her duty. The law rarely asked whether the bride had been prepared, willing, or able. It asked only whether the union had been performed. Fear thus became legal obligation, stamped with seals and signatures. Medical knowledge added its own weight. Physicians of the time, guided by ancient texts, declared that women were naturally passive and required male initiation to balance their humors. Some believed that without consummation, a woman's health would falter, that unspent seed could poison the body, that silence of the womb could lead to hysteria. The language of medicine clothed violence in the guise of remedy. To refuse was to invite illness, they claimed. To endure was to achieve harmony. Brides heard these words, repeated not only by doctors, but also by midwives, who had been taught to believe them, reinforcing the notion that suffering was health's requirement. Theology added its own chorus. Priests preached that marriage was holy and that consummation completed its sacrament. A wife's silence was praised as piety, her endurance as proof of obedience to God's order. Confessors reminded women that their role was to submit, that pain was part of divine design, echoing Eve's punishment. Scripture was quoted to justify endurance, turning fear into a mark of holiness. The chamber became not only a bedroom, but also a sanctuary in which endurance was a prayer and silence a hymn. Together, these forces, law, medicine, and theology, created a fortress around fear. A woman standing at her wedding threshold knew she carried not only the weight of her family's expectations, but also the decrees of courts, the pronouncements of physicians, and the sermons of priests. Each one spoke with authority. Each one reinforced the same message: endure, submit, remain silent. But authority did not eliminate resistance. Women whispered counter-narratives even within the shadows of these institutions. A midwife might advise a bride quietly that herbs could ease the ordeal, contradicting the physician's decree. Some confessors, moved by compassion, suggested prayers not for endurance but for relief, daring to offer empathy instead of command. In certain towns, women gathered to share stories, weaving their own theology of survival, one where God valued not silence, but endurance, transformed into care for others. These fragments of defiance lived at the margins, small but stubborn. Imagine the chamber under this fortress of authority. The bride lies trembling, knowing that outside the door, the law demands consummation. The physician declares her health depends on it, and the priest preaches that God commands her silence. The walls echo with decrees she cannot escape. Her fear is not only her own. It has been institutionalized, given form in parchment, ink, and sermon. What she feels in her heart is mirrored in the scrolls of courts, the pages of medical treatises, the pulpits of churches. The dread becomes heavier because it is sanctioned by power. This institutional reinforcement ensured that fear was not dismissed as weakness, but praised as obedience. A woman who trembled was not pitied. She was sanctified. A bride who endured pain was celebrated as a model of virtue. In this way, the structures that should have offered protection instead transformed dread into doctrine, teaching women that their silence was not only expected but holy. And still, resistance flickered. Mothers passed down not only warnings but also tools, herbs to dull pain, prayers reimagined as shields, secret knowledge that whispered, "You are not alone." These small acts did not topple institutions, but they carved spaces where women could breathe within walls built to suffocate them. Looking back, we see the paradox. Law, medicine, and theology claim to sanctify marriage, but in practice, they sanctified fear. The question that lingers is stark. When authority declares suffering to be sacred, who dares to question the sanctity itself? Fear has been our guide and our witness across this story. A low note carried from chamber to corridor, from village lane to vaulted court. We watched a young bride step beneath a canopy, while torches hissed, and guests pretended that thunderous laughter could pass for blessing. We stood in a cottage, where rough music shook the shutters, and learned how a private hour can be stolen by a crowd. We traced the way law, medicine, and priestly words tied dread to duty, until it sat like a stone on the breast. Now the circle closes. To understand the whole, we must gather every fragment. The braid tight with protective knots, the sheet folded like a verdict, the whisper traded by firelight, and hold them in one pair of open hands. The chamber is smaller than memory, suggests. In drawings it looks grand, but real rooms are made of breath, shadows, and the scrape of a latch. The bed is a structure and a sentence. Curtains do two things at once. They shield and they silence. A crucifix leans in the candle glow, a relic, glitters. A sprig of blessed green dries in the heat. Objects look faithful when arranged with care, and still they participate in the ritual that empties a voice. The bride learns where the floorboards complain, and where they keep a secret. She also learns that the body remembers better than paper, and that paper remembers better than the crowd, because the crowd prefers a story with a joke at the end. In the great hall, the sheet becomes a proclamation. It is lifted, inspected, praised as proof, as if virtue were a stain and tenderness an error. In the lane outside a cottage, proof arrives as rumour. Two neighbours argue about what they heard, and a third sings the argument so the melody can carry it across a field. A woman listens to her own life as told by someone who was not there. She learns the old political truth in a domestic key. Whoever controls the narrative controls the memory, and whoever controls the memory decides what mercy is owed. The fortress. Around fear has three familiar towers. The first is law. Parchment and seal announce that consummation completes the contract, which means refusal can be judged, which means silence is safer than speech. The second is medicine. A learned voice explains that harmony sits in the body only when the body submits, and so discomfort becomes therapy and protest becomes diagnosis. The third is theology. A sermon names obedience as holy and frames endurance as the route to grace. Together, these towers cast a long shadow. Authority does not need to shout when architecture does the speaking. Still, there are doorways in the wall. The midwife keeps a drawer of herbs and a notebook that lives only in her memory. Mothers braid hair and tuck a leaf into the twist, not because the leaf can stop a hand, but because a hidden sign can remind a frightened mind that it is not alone. A priest with a gentler heart preaches about kindness and leaves a pause where others insert command. A steward discovers that a tray of wine at the right moment can scatter a crowd. These are small strategies, but small strategies make rooms that would otherwise disappear. Generations carry the burden forward. A lullaby travels from cradle to cradle and hides a map between its notes. Stories lean toward the successful survivor and call survival wisdom, then forget to mention the price. A mother teaches a daughter how to trim a lamp, where to stand in a doorway, how to breathe from the ribs when panic wants the throat. She does not describe the first night in words, and still the description arrives, wrapped in gestures, folded into chores, sealed inside a recipe written with careful hands. Fear is not the only thing that moves along this line. Ingenuity travels, too. Courage does not always look like a shout. Sometimes it looks like a list of errands arranged in a merciful order. We have not pretended that every home was cruel. There were chambers where tenderness took root and grew sturdy. A husband learned to listen. A wife learned that trust can reintroduce her to her own breath. Those marriages rarely appear in chronicles because scandal is better ink than patience. Still, we owe them a place in the record we carry in our minds. Without them, the past sounds like a single drumbeat. With them, it sounds like a song where a low sorrow is joined by a soft harmony that keeps time for the long walk ahead. Consider, though, how communities trained themselves to call the spectacle a blessing. Rough music was labelled honor, mockery was called tradition, display was renamed proof, laughter rehearsed cruelty until it could be delivered on cue. The soul learns what the crowd rewards. If applause follows a joke about a trembling bride, applause will follow the next joke as well. A boy grows into a man who believes that pleasure improves with witnesses. A girl grows into a woman who suspects that safety evaporates when doors open. In this way, a single night recruits an entourage of habits that visit other nights without knocking. The record of this world is kept in several scripts. In one script, we find laws, sermons, and accounts. In another, we find textile, furniture, and the choreography of hands. The second archive is harder to read, but it is also harder to falsify. Linen creases where it was gripped. Wood darkens where years of shoulders leaned. A latch smooths under fingers that learned to close it quietly. Trace the marks, and you will find the unregistered history of endurance. It does not take the place of testimony, but it stands beside testimony and nods when testimony falters. Imagine a different morning after. No display in the hall, no song in the lane. Breakfast is bread, cheese, and a shared silence that respects, rather than erases. A neighbor delivers broth and leaves it on the step without comment. A priest blesses the house and adds, for the benefit of all who listen, that gentleness is a better sign than proof. A lawmaker rewrites a clause so that contract can live without inspection. A physician remembers that healing begins when harm is not prescribed as cure. These are not impossible scenes. They are the outline of a better habit waiting for hands, willing to practice it. So we arrive at the question that will follow you long after the lamp is dark. When a culture calls suffering tradition, who dares to rename the ceremony and who teaches the mouth a different refrain? Perhaps the work begins with a single refusal to laugh at a cruel joke, a single choice to let the sheet remain folded and private, a single pause in which a person of authority removes command from a sentence and inserts care. From small edits, a text becomes readable. From new readings, a future learns how to speak without borrowing harm from its ancestors. If you have walked this distance with me, you have listened to voices that history muffled and nearly misplaced. Listening is not a cure, but it is a door. Behind that door stands remembrance, and behind remembrance stands responsibility. To notice the old patterns when they walk into new rooms wearing modern coats. To choose whether to applaud or to open a window. To pass on not the weight of dread, but the tools that make breathing possible. This is how an inheritance changes hands without passing along its bruise. There is one more ledger we should open before we close the cover. It belongs to the daughters who did not pass the same braid, who snipped 2 knots and tied a new one, named Refuge. They learned to store a loaf where a friend could find it, to borrow a cousin's cart without confessing the reason, to ask a midwife to visit under the pretext of measuring linen. They practiced a grammar of safety made from errands, candles, and calendars. Some of those gestures look small on paper. In a life, they feel enormous. A window opened at the right minute can change a winter. A message tucked in the margin of a prayer can change a plan. We should read those minutes and margins as part of the text, because they teach the sentence the rest of the book was trying to say. Care is a structure, and structures can be built where walls once stood. Thank you for giving your quiet to these quieted lives. If the story has given you a place to rest and a reason to think, consider staying for more journeys. Your presence here turns a monologue into a circle, and circles are where stories learn to breathe. When you return, bring your questions. Leave the door on the latch. Let gentleness be the first guest who crosses the threshold.